The year is 2020 and this camera is 10 years old. Can it hold up against today's cameras? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Joe for Video and today we take a look at the GH2, the old predecessor of the mighty GH5. The GH2 was first released in 2010, 10 years ago, a decade. Panasonic sold this camera for 850 euros. On the used market you get a GH2 for around 100 to 150 euros. So this camera could be a great bargain and a great choice for beginners. We will put this camera through its paces. We will look at build quality, image quality and how it holds up for today's standards in comparison to the newest MFT flagship model of Panasonic, the GH5, which is filming me right now. If you want to get a picture of its image quality, I took the camera out today for a nice cinematic nature video. Have fun with it. The camera is not the greatest when it comes to dynamic range. If you try to underexpose it, I can't really recommend it because you introduce very nasty noise. I would always try to expose the camera correctly and use what you get. You don't get the greatest highlights and you also don't get the greatest shadows, but you will get a great image in between. Just use what you have. You don't get a log or a flat image profile like you get on newer cameras like the GH5. But you can use the smooth profile, which is, in my opinion, the profile for the biggest dynamic range. The GH2 uses a multi-aspect ratio sensor and a MFT mount. It means you get an effectively wider field of view in comparison to the GH5. The GH5 crops from the top and bottom to get the 16:9 picture. The GH2 doesn't do that. It uses a wider sensor, so you get an effectively wider field of view. If you want to shoot on a camera that is already 10 years old, it's clear you have some drawbacks. For example, you don't get 4K. This camera can't shoot 4K. Even though it has a 16 megapixel sensor, it only shoots HD. But if you don't need 4K, this camera can be a great option. But it also is not a great slow motion camera. This camera maxes out at 720p with 60 frames per second. The problem is 720p isn't really sharp. If you want to scale it up you can do, but it's noticeable that you get a lower image quality. I don't think you can use the slow motion for professional use, but for YouTube it might be okay. The HD image quality is good enough even for today's standards. What this camera also set it apart was the fact that it got hacked. I used the Flow Motion 2.02. You can look over at personalview.com and get the news of the latest hacks and how to hack it. If you hack your camera, please consider that it might brick your camera and that you need a fast SD card. If you don't feel comfortable using this camera with the hack, don't do it. But if you want to do it and you don't brick your camera, the image quality really is great. I got this camera because I was curious what it is like to own this camera, because I always wanted it. And when it came out, I wasn't able to afford it. Now I use the GH5, which is a great camera. But when I got this camera in hand, I was like, wow, this is a small camera. It's so lightweight, but it still is nice holding in your hands. It got a flippy screen. Look at that. That's something Sony hasn't figured out yet. Panasonic did it 10 years ago. And also you get a microphone input. The problem with that microphone input is it's only 2.5 millimeters and you need an adapter cable for 3.5 millimeters. It's not a big deal. If you get it used, you might get an adapter cable already with it, like I did. What I don't like about the flip-out screen is the fact that it has a low resolution and doesn't show the right exposure and colors. The colors are off and the exposure is also a little bit overexposed. So the image you see on the display is a completely different image that you see on the computer. The menu system, well, let's say it aged. If you compare it to a modern menu system like the GH5, you will notice a difference. It's really old, it really feels old, but it gets the job done, and I think the user interface is not the most important thing when you consider the price point. If you want to use this camera handheld, you have to consider two things. First, the sensor is not stabilized. You should use a stabilized lens. And if you don't want to use a stabilized lens, this body is really light, so you don't get the natural stabilization you get from a big body. I did a test in comparison to the IBIS of the GH5 with the Sigma 24-105 f4 with the Metabones Speedbooster. You can see in the footage that the stabilized lens is great, but you get a much smoother footage with the GH5 and its IBIS. If you don't want to use this camera with a stabilized lens, you should consider getting a tripod, a gimbal, a Steadicam or a slider of some sorts, because the handheld footage is not really usable in my opinion. In the world of vloggers and YouTube, autofocus is king. This camera has autofocus, but I wouldn't really use it because it hunts a lot, is really slow and it's not really reliable. So consider using manual focus for it. If you hack the camera, you get an unlimited recording time. With the small DMW BLC12 batteries, you can get up to 2 hours of recording time. I was really surprised when I found that out. I think it's great for a camera this small and uses such small batteries. Really great. The camera has 3 modes of video recording. First, 24p, which is not real 24p, but 23.98 frames per second, which is no problem for most people. Also, it has a 50 or 60i mode and a 720, 50p and 60p mode. The preamps on this camera are not that bad. If you get a regular microphone for it and you have the right adapter cable, you can use it anytime and the sound sounds great. Now, let's compare this camera to the GH5, the king of Micro Four Thirds. The GH5 wins in almost every category. It has a greater dynamic range, about 2 to 3 stops more. It has a log profile, which this camera doesn't have. It also shines in HD resolution. I think it could be a tie there, but there is a little bit of extra resolution in the GH5 footage. Also, you get 10-bit video with the GH5. The GH2 only shoots 420 8-bit footage. When it comes to vlogging, I did a short test so you can see how this camera fares against the GH5.
This is a short vlogging test with the GH5. I'm using the Metabones Speedbooster and the Sigma 10-20 with the Rode video mic on top. And I think it's doing a great job. The IBIS is great, the dynamic range is, I mean it's a very tough condition even for the GH5, but I think it's doing a great job. Now the same test with the GH2, with the same lenses, Metabones Speedbooster and Sigma 10-20. You need an adapter cable for the microphone, not a big deal. I think it's noticeable that this camera has no IBIS and the lower dynamic range also shows, but I think it's not. The image looks not that bad, even for its age. Now the same vlogging test with the Lumix 14-140. It's a stabilized lens and it's a native for the GH2. It's a very tight frame, but you tell me, does it look better than the unstabilized lens?
But there is still one thing this camera wins against the GH5, and that is sensor size. Since this is a multi-aspect ratio sensor, you get a far wider field of view than with the GH5. If you put a Metabones Speedbooster XL on it, you get a crop factor of around 1.28. That is amazing. That's far greater than APS-C sized sensor and only a little bit smaller than full frame. And what about this scenario? I'm filming on the GH5 with the Metabones Speedbooster and the Sigma 18-35 1.8 right now. So let's switch cameras. Now we are on the GH2. I think the image looks fine, but one problem is that I use the GH5 with a shotgun mic and an adapter. So you need to get a separate solution for the GH2. Something to consider. What's my conclusion? I think this camera is a great bargain. You get nice HD image quality. If you want, you can use the 720p 50 and 60 for slow motion. It's nice, small and compact. You can take it anywhere. I know it shows its age. The monitor is not the greatest. There is no 4K or slow motion, no log picture profile or 10-bit to speak about. But what you get is a great 8-bit camera, which gives you nice HD resolution with a moderate dynamic range. But if you know how to use the tool, you can get great image quality. Try to get one for around 100 to 150 euros. It's a great camera. The GH3 is the successor to this camera. It has the GH4 body and 1080p 50 and 60, so you get better slow motion. Other than that, the image quality will be the same. The GH3 sells for around 300 to 400 euros on the used market, so I think this camera is the better choice. You get cinematic images for a great price point, a very versatile mount because you can use any lens if you want to. You can use vintage lenses, you can use modern MFT lenses. The MFT mount is really flexible. It also takes the Metabones speed boosters and other focal reducers. So if you are a beginner or on a tight budget, consider this camera. I really liked it. It was a great blast from the past. And what about you? Did you own this camera or are you considering buying one now? Let me know in the comments below. And please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It would really help to grow my channel. I hope you have a nice day and create something beautiful.